we're here aboard the Battleship Iowa, and my name is Mike Getscher, and I've arrived at some position here called the Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer, and to me, really importantly, Chief Engineer. And I've got a fun background for this. I've been in nonprofits now for 26 years. I've got about 1,000 days of sea time as a merchant marine engineer, and I just have a love for battleships. My dad was a battleship sailor, so here we are. So just having a good time. Now I'm in my 13th year, I believe, and a lot of you have been with us here for that long as well. So thanks for coming down. Wanted to chat about dry docking today. This is one of the most asked questions we have. Why aren't we dry docking? You know, what is it that we're going to do? We're going to talk about just a handful of questions here. The first one is, do we need to dry dock? Another one is, what are our options for dry docking? That's probably the most interesting aspect of today's presentation, or maybe the most surprising. And what are the alternatives we can have for dry docking? And how do we solve the real problems that we actually have? And I think the first thing that most people think is we should, right? Everybody wants to. Raise your hand if you want to see the Iowa out of the water. Come on. Marguerite, what's the deal? We all want to see the ship out of the water. It looks really cool. These are great shots. These would have been in Norfolk back in the 80s. What an impressive sight it would be. And certainly it's a great opportunity to solve some problems and address some maintenance issues. But what are the real issues surrounding that? Why aren't we? Why are we going to just run off to a dry dock anytime soon? It's exciting stuff. And here, but this is the big news. We have no current plans to dry dock this vessel. This kind of put a lot of people on their ear in the industry. They said, you're kidding, why not? Why aren't you going to do that for sure as a priority? And we're going to get to some of the reasons why here throughout this presentation. There you go. Why would be the next one? So we have options, right? Or do we? Here we go. So what do we need if we're going to go into dry dock? The dry dock has to have a sufficient tonnage capacity or size for us. We are 887 feet long. I think the waterline length is around 850. I've revised, actually, I need to revise the tonnage here. We are 46,000 and change tons, almost 46.8 right now. A little bit more than this presentation, which dates back a year, indicates. But we displaced quite a bit of water here. And understand too, I think I kind of described a little bit, we have both floating dry dock options and also grading docks, and you'll see images of both here. It needs to have a sill depth, and that's the crossing point of a dry dock that can handle our depth. You guys all know the draft of the ship right now. Most of your crew members back aft, I believe we are 32 feet 3 inches, forward 27 feet 6 inches. I know that by heart, and Bill Maggio, of course, wrote it on a nice note that says "Love Obi-Wan." It's on my wall right there. It needs to be within a reasonable distance for tow. I'm not going to consider something on the East Coast. That makes perfect sense. By the way, I can't go out of the country. As a part of our contract, the Navy will not let us take this vessel anywhere but the U.S. shipyard or dry dock. And it needs to have the structural capability to handle the loads from the docking keel and the skegs. It's something that I'm going to explain a little bit more of as we get into this. We need to have a current docking plan. Fortunately, I have two. In fact, there's a version D1 and D2. You'll see part of D2 here later. And we need some money. We need a lot of money. Upwards of $20 million. I think it's actually quite a bit more than that, but we'll get around to that here in a moment. Real quickly, a floating dry dock. This is a normal anatomy. You have a sill over there. In our world, in the maritime world, once the vessel crosses the sill, it's the responsibility of the shipyard. Again, on the floating dry dock, you have wing walls on either side. They can be of different heights. You can also have a pontoon. A grading dock, I should have put a slide in here, but it's basically just a big slot in the side of the land, and it's got a gate on the end, and you just float the vessel in, close the gate, drain it out, and off you go. Those are called grading docks. You'll see a great image of one here. Actually, several images of it. So just a fun fact, that maybe we're the largest dry docks in the world. 5 of them are in China, 3 in Korea, 1 in Taiwan, 1 in India. So not getting into the politics of it, but during the BRAC Commission, during the traditions, well, 20, 30 years ago, we lost some of our shipyard capability in America, so sadly we don't have as much. And it's something that does in fact affect what we're talking about today. So we're looking at dry dock options here in the Western Hemisphere. I probably should not have used the red line all the way down into Mexico, but we're just playing for fun here. It also includes Hawaii, so the western half of the United States are options that we would consider. And we're going to dive right into some of the options that we might have. I'm going to start up north, Pacific Northwest. I see Troy waving. Am I good? Okay. Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. What you see there is a graving dock on the right, one big hole in the ground, and that is a CVN, or nuclear carrier in there. But this is a naval shipyard. It's Bremerton Drydock number 6, and it's completely booked with Navy work. It is unavailable to commercial work, and we are no longer an official naval vessel. There's no way that they would have the time, nor is there any contractual manner in which we could have them do any of that work. Moving on in the same region up there in Seattle, we're going to go to Vigor Industrial. Interesting name. And their largest dry dock is 640 feet long and only has a capacity of 22,000 tons. So it literally cannot handle the Iowa. So that's just too small. Moving south, San Francisco, some time ago, BAE Systems, the British firm, had the old Hunters Point dry dock. And they basically went out of business. They sold it off to Puglia Engineering. But before they did that, they told us that that dry dock would not be able to handle the Iowa out of structural concerns. That was 2012. Jonathan and Robert and I, in fact, met with BAE on the vessel up in Sassoon Bay, and that's when they told us it's not going to work. And I'll explain the structural here in a moment because it comes up repeatedly. Unfortunately, the shipyard went bankrupt anyways, regardless, so even with the structural concerns, by the way, $22 million in repairs needed for that dry dock. I'm not about to try to put the Iowa on that thing. So basically, nothing really works up there in San Francisco at all. And we have those structural concerns that were already stated. This is LA. Yeah, there's nothing here. Back in the day, even back in the late 80s when I was working on Terminal Island, literally watching ships being scrapped over here. Southwest Marine was in full swing. Before that, we had Todd Shipyards. FFGs were built back here. George Muselin worked here and literally cut his teeth on FFGs, not 2,000 feet from here. But all of that is gone from LA. There's nothing here in Los Angeles at all of any size or magnitude that can handle a vessel this size. So moving on down south to San Diego, it seems kind of an obvious one. This is a floating dry dock right there. NASCO, National Steel and Shipbuilding Company, they build vessels for the Navy. They have one that's certified for 44,000 tons. Again, we're a little bit heavier than that. But, of course, we're 46.8 actually, 46.7. I think Jim Crash has the numbers. He did a great job reviewing that recently, actually helping the New Jersey. They also have low wing walls. I mentioned that in the anatomy of a dry dock. This means that we would need to invest in $1 to $2 million of blocks underneath it. They could only put 3-foot blocks. We would be working this far off the bottom trying to paint the bottom of the vessel if we can even get it into the dry dock, which is the last issue that we have. So that's a tremendous investment. Plus it's outside of the 44,000 tons that we have. We have something called drag. I just mentioned to you the draft back aft at 32.6. Or I'm sorry, 32.3, 27 feet 6 forward. That's almost 6 foot difference between the fore and aft of the ship. To be able to balance that out and bring her to an even keel will take at least 1,000 tons of additional displacement up forward. That's going to exceed even further the limit of $44,000 on the NASCO dry dock. It's also going to create new stresses in the hull. Each one of those tanks, I'm thinking of Chief Moser, where are you at there? Each one of those tanks up there, nominally 55 tons, only brings the bow down 2 inches. 2 inches, 55 tons per tank. So you have to bring it down 6 feet or thereabouts to bring the stern up. So basically you're running 35 or 40 inches of actual displacement change. And you're going to bring her down so deep that you can't even get it across the sill of that dry dock. So we're going to toss that one out too. Moving on to BAE Systems, they also work on ships down there. They don't do any new builds that I'm aware of, but they do have a large dry dock. You can see it there with 2 DDGs inside. It's a nice dry dock. I think it's fairly new, But back in 2017, we actually had an attorney for BAE walk aboard the vessel and talk to me and say, Mike, we're not going to touch your vessel ever for the same reasons, the structural concerns of the weight of this vessel on their dry dock. So they are also out of the market for Iowas on the West Coast. So what are those structural challenges? This is a great image, of course, of the skegs. Some of you know what they look like. They house the inboard propeller shafts, but there's also a docking keel. And it's a big problem for Iowas, something that nobody really understands. BBs are heavy. Iowa actually broke dry dock number 1 over in Long Beach back in 1945. That's documented in Dick Landgraf's book. It cracked the actual base of the dry dock. It's something they had to deal with. They had leakages there for years. So these things are heavy and they've got problems. I mean, it's really about concentrated load. All of the weight of the aft end of the vessel is on those skegs and on the dry dock or the docking keel in the middle, which is right underneath turret 3. Back in World War II, the floating dry docks were capable of handling this. They had 2-inch steel decks, and they were designed to deal with this kind of structural concern. This is docking plan D2, just describing the two. D1 is, I think, 6-foot clearance between blocks. D2 is 8 foot. You have different versions of it. These actually came from our friends up north. I'll actually show you the dry dock, in fact, where I received these. And I'm going to walk up here and show you a little bit, or just kind of point out by hand. You can see in the profile, this is the skeg. There's going to be 2 of them. Back here is the end of a docking keel. You can see, it's hard to see up closely, isn't it? Oh, you can't focus. You've got a row of blocks here, and then back here you've got one just underneath the docking keel. And those types of the loads that are represented underneath those keels are just too much for the floating dry docks that we're talking about. Most grading docks can handle it, but again, dry dock number 1 in Long Beach was a pretty big dry dock, and it broke a long time ago. So moving out west a little bit further, we've got Pearl Harbor. This is Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, another naval shipyard, of course. It is not a commercial yard. This dry dock handled the Missouri back. When did the Battleship movie come out? It would have been 11, I think, 2011 or 12. So they handled it about then. They actually did some shots before that. So I think it was a year or 2 before. But the problem is, although BAE used to lease that dry dock from the Navy changed their contract regulations, and BAE walked away from their commercial work at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. They were leasing that dry dock for commercial work, mostly for cruise ships. And by the way, it requires a $6 million 6-week round-trip tow minimum. Now in 2012 or 13, I actually got a quote from South Brothers. It was $6 million. That was when fuel prices were probably on the order of $3.50, $4 a gallon. Now they're probably $6. I could be looking at a $10 or $12 million tow. You have the risk associated with that. You have the prep time associated with that. You have all of the insurance requirements associated with that for essentially a 1.5-month tow round trip. Plus, by the way, when you're thinking about the cost of a dry dock, you're shutting down your operation for the entire length of time. So if there's no income, that's exactly right, Captain Abley. 6 weeks of just the tow alone, it's a 1.5 months of shutdown. People are out of work, there's no place to go down here. Plus you're looking at 8 to 12 weeks of work in a dry dock, potentially, unless you can speed it up. There's a lot around that, but you've got a tremendously long downtime for all of your revenue stream being gone. So it's a big deal for us to do that. Another thing I wanted to mention was tugboat issues. Back in 2012 when we were trying to tow, and I think a few people here remember this, finding a large enough tugboat to handle this ship was a big deal. The Invader class tug here, the Warrior, is the one that pulled us down south. She had 75 tons of bollard pull. We have to have a minimum of 65 tons for our tow requirements. Let me wait for the sound here. All right, moving on from sweepers. So large ocean-going tugs are a challenge to get. There's a bunch of different restrictions. We were looking at towing on Memorial Day weekend. The problem is in late spring, the Alaska oil fields open up. And so all of the big tugboats are heading north to make money. And literally, we almost didn't find a tugboat to tow us north back in 2012. So you have a real challenge finding one of these larger vessels to be able to do it, and you have to find it at the right time of year. And there's going to be some other potential weather considerations to have just for dry docking as well. So pretty big deal to find the right tugboat. So I'm going to backtrack here to Portland. This is Vigor Industrial. They have the largest, I should have mentioned here, floating dry dock in the country. It's creatively named Vigorous, which I think is kind of hilarious. And it's 960 feet long. It is one big floating dry dock, and it's got an 80,000 ton capacity. This thing is big. And that, in fact, is a picture from me. I visited Vigor a few years ago. This is where I received the docking plans. They actually, on our behalf, reached out to Naval Sea Systems Command to get the current docking plans, the actual legitimate ones, in both paper form, which are in my office, and also in AutoCAD. So they're very helpful. This is one big dry dock. And they designed this thing specifically to handle the twin skid issues that we have. So there's zero question, zero doubt that this dry dock can handle this. This is really the best and only commercial option on the West Coast, period. But it's got one big downside. We got to get across the Columbia River Bar. All right, you're talking about a dead ship tow across one of the most dangerous bodies of water in the nation. It can certainly be done. In fact, it is done. But this is something to consider. Are you going to take your most important asset and take it across the bar? You may have to be out there for 2 weeks waiting for the perfect window. By the way, each day of a tugboat, even back in 2012, was $30,000 a day just the cost. The fuel for those things is often $15,000 a day on top of that, so you're talking $50,000 a day just to have one tugboat hang on to you every single day. So big deal if you have to wait for a couple weeks to get that weather window just perfect, and you don't become the next big news cycle for the nation, do we? So we don't have a lot of great options, right? By the way, you need that wonderful Bank of the Universe 20 million plus. We don't really know exactly. I've got some quotes up to 20. Back in 2012, if we were to go to BAE in Pearl Harbor with the $6 million tow. I'm cutting out a little bit, guys. But you're still talking 20 million plus and probably closer to 30. So summing it up, there's only 3 dry docks in the western half of the nation which can handle the ship, and only one of them is available. And let's understand, when you're thinking about a business, just doing a dry dock scenario for us is 4 times our annual budget, minimum. So think about it as a non-museum ship business. Would you, as a CEO of a business, consider taking 4 years of budget just to do one-time thing every 20 or 30 years? It's a big call. So, what are we going to do? By the way, crazy idea, heavy lift ship, probably 30 million. I actually looked into it a little bit. Not that they don't like to have their ships tied up that much, but that's an amazing thing to see, isn't it? It's pretty cool. So current Iowa status, well, let's go back, take a step back and think about who we are and what kind of shape we're in. We were thoroughly mothballed before being placed into inactive status. There's only a couple things we didn't like that they didn't do, namely inside some of the piping, chill water specifically. But the rest of it they did a great job on. Come on. We have impressed current cathodic protection, ICCP, you'll hear me say that a lot. We also had dehumidification for those 20 years. 10 years on the East Coast, 10 years on the West Coast, they had DH everywhere. They kept the cathodic protection on religiously. We've maintained that for almost the entire time. We had some downtime during Richmond because we just didn't have it running yet, but we got it up and running as soon as we got here, so we're in good shape. Our readings are taken almost monthly. Sometimes we slip. Chief, we do a pretty good job, and George tracks it all the time. We've got a log. We've actually watched it consistently. We do annual underwater inspections, with the exception of during COVID. We found no anomalies. We're always looking for hot spots. And our internal ballast tanks are protected. This is the first ship in the entire historic naval ships fleet to do that. So our freshwater ballast inside is also being protected by ICCP. I'm not talking about that today. So wind and waterline corrosion is the primary concern that we have. We're going to show that to you. So wind and waterline is a unique environment. It's the most vulnerable area of the hull. It is unprotected by ICCP because ICCP only works in the water. And at that point, at the wind and water line, you have a constant replenishment of ions and chlorides, and also that vicious cycle of wet and dry all the time. So we have 2 specific problem areas. We're going to talk about the light material forward, frame 50. Chief Moser knows a lot about this. He's headed that way here pretty soon. I'll actually explain the material here in a moment.
And we also have amidships where we have galvanic action between rivets and armor plate. That armor plate there is 1.5 inches thick. What's interesting here is that ICCP system, or cathodic protection, protects everything in the water. That red line there is the nominal water line of the vessel. You can see underneath that you have a little bit of dark brown, which is a little bit of corrosion, a little bit of rust there, and some really clear material below that. And above it you see those rivets, which are wasting away in specific areas. There's actually rivets below that red line, but you don't see them because they're not wasting away. One thing that most people don't understand is the ship is made of 3 different steels on the hull. This is something I give credit to Stretch Morse. I was privileged to meet him back in probably 1984 aboard the Battleship Massachusetts. Commander retired. He's still with us, well into his 80s. But he talked about this back then, and it's been largely ignored by the historic naval ships community. The ship is made of 3 different steels. You have a mild steel forward. The plans literally show MS. They have a high tensile steel, or HTS, sometimes denoted as HS on some of the drawings I've seen. That's going to be in some of the other areas. It's considered a light armor or a structural material. And then you have the special treatment steel, or the armor plate. In this case, it's a decapping plate, torpedo and shell protection up there amidships in the higher portions of the hull. And aft is essentially the same thing. So you have 3 different types of steel, and they have much different characteristics. They're very different. This is a homogeneous chromium nickel armor. So just to give you some reference point, your standard steel, you might build something or buy at Home Depot or even Tel Steel around here. Normal supplier is going to be a 36,000 psi tensile strength steel. This is in the 110 to 125 range. This is actually tougher stuff than they are currently building submarines out of. All right, this is some really amazing stuff. It's a high noble metal too, and I'll explain that in a moment as well. It's got nickel and chromium, so it has some aspects almost like a stainless steel. It's very, very tough stuff. The HTS, which is high-level construction or light armor, has a presumed yield of about 80,000. They didn't keep track of some of the metallurgy back in the day, but this is from Nathan Oakham, who has a pretty good feel for it. He just passed away recently too, Dave, didn't he? We just lost him. So this is a pretty tough material as well. It's got a little bit more chromium and nickel in it, but not as much as the STS. And then this mild steel down here, we believe to be standard A36 type. There's hardly any of that chromium or nickel. In fact, there's none, hardly at all. So it's a much milder material, and it's reflected in the kind of condition that you see in this amazing environment of salt water. So we do reach out to people. It's not just me sitting in my office dreaming this stuff up or talking to Chief. Pat Moran, who retired actually just a couple of years ago from the Naval Academy, taught corrosion to the mids there. And he and I met some years ago at one of the Hensa conferences. Wonderful man. He and I chatted. I was, of course, fortunate my son was at the academy, so we kind of knew of everybody, and we talked a little bit. And he said, yes, he would be concerned about the trimetallic hull, especially long-term and a low grade. And I also found Sam Connor, and I always forget this particular acronym. I think it's the Association of Materials, Painting and Performance, or some bizarre amalgamation of multiple organizations. But he's on the board of directors for AMPP. And I've gone to, you can see that funny thing up there, Mega Rust. It's actually an annual affair on each coast for the Navy, for all the people, the different contractors that take care of vessels. And 2 years ago, I went down to Mega Rust in San Diego and met Sam down there. And I'd like to go again. I think there's another one this year. It's really a good thing to do. You can go there and find out a lot of the new technologies and new paints. But you can also be bored to tears with some of the contract language that they talk about for the Navy. But Sam was really helpful, and we've talked about this extensively with him. The mild steel, you can see here, the mild steel will be on the left. That's going to be the less noble metal, and the cathode, or the high tensile strength steel, is going to be on the right. And you're going to end up with this minor galvanic effect. And it's going to be anodic. So you're going to see in a moment the pictures of the mild steel up forward, which are in really rough shape. Hot rivets are a different problem. When you heat up a metal like that, you actually damage the material. You change the chemical composition. And then you're going to slam it into and hot set it on a piece of armor plate. So what you do is you create another galvanic problem between now what is considered to be a poorly treated steel to a very highly treated steel. Plus these are mild steel rivets anyway, so you have this kind of double whammy of problem with rivets and really good steel. And then of course you throw that interesting environment in and you've got a big problem. So the big strip there, wind and waterline, is what we're really focused on right now, especially. There's going to be a couple of other areas long term, and I'll get to those at the very end. So here's that damn Cofferdam. This is a funny image I found online. I like to joke that was Mary, but it really looks more like Paco now. So it's got a funny little sump pump down there. It's largely been in semi-continuous use since 17. I think we dropped off during COVID. That's to be expected. And now I think our goal is what, Dave, 150 or 60 feet a year we're trying to do. But you can see the process. You've been watching it now. So it's quite a bit of work. Basic anatomy. You've got a neoprene gasket on the face. You've got a sump pump inside to keep Paco's feet dry. You've got lifting eyes. You've got attachment eyes. You've got support legs and platforms. You've got a passive cathodic system, usually a couple of zincs on it. I don't know if we keep them on there too much. You're in and out so much, it probably doesn't matter. Plus, it's protected by the ICCP system when it's aboard the ship. And they weigh about 2,000. I suspect the new one's a little bit heavier, Dave. 2,200, 2,500?
Pretty close.
Yeah, something like that. So a lot of you know what this looks like, but just sharing the great image. That's our design based on the original one that was given to us by a contractor. We just built another one. And we have these cool pad eyes. They're kind of hard to see there on the right, but that's the design on the left. That's an AutoCAD drawing. Basically, we use them to hang the Cofferdam with. And now we have Mary. Mary's down in there. We're basically hanging a box to the side of the vessel and treating that first, 3.5 feet, 3 feet of below the wind and water line so we can address all these issues and stand and keep our feet dry. This is how you hang it. That's that pad eye. The lower slot is there to allow for adjustment. If you're working in the ops team, you'll know that these hulls are not flat. They're wavy, they're all over the map. And in fact, they're starting to get some challenging areas. I think, George, the last one you did, or 2 times ago, it was so wavy you had to add extra gaskets to it. So it's a challenge. These things are not as slab-sided as you might think, but we do have adjustment. You can also use that top hole there to suck it up if you have to. And then they add another pad eye down below just to suck up against that hull. And now you can see that water line roughly where those brown spots are below the rivet line. So it really exposes an awful lot of the vessel right there that you can address all of your issues with. Of course, we deploy it with either a crane, boat, or gradle. We also developed a davit system so we can hang things off the side and move them more easily. And we'll test that on the port side. And we've added all this equipment, about $25,000. All the initial funding for this came from the Iowa State grant from a few years ago. And you can make any shape of Cofferdam. We've already had the bow done. This was done by our Muldoon Marine friends. So we've already addressed the very tip of the ship. And we're going to go around the corner here as soon as we can. This is a much larger Cofferdam on the USS North Carolina. And it has an adapter piece on it. You can kind of see that shape. It's a little curved. Let me try to step up without killing myself here. The main Cofferdam is here, and you've got this curved piece here with a neoprene gasket, and it's an adapter plate that can adapt to the shape of the hull. They chose to try to use this very large Cofferdam some years ago, and since then I've gone on to another style, and I'll show you that here towards the very end of the presentation. This is our first exposure in 2017, starboard bow. We wanted to choose that ugly section. You can see it's pretty doggone ugly right there, and we're going to show you that in detail. This is the amidships exposure. Again, you can see the rivets that are breaking apart above the waterline and the largely decent material down below. And this is at least a year old. I think you're a little bit further. You're behind the aft gangway number 4, so I need to revise this if I'm going to show it too much further. But we've done quite a bit of the hull. Again, 850 feet of water line, you're looking at 1,700 feet of total length. And as we like to joke, this is just like the guys that paint the bridges. You start on one end, go to the other, and you start over again. So this is a long-term, forever gig that we'll always be doing. Paco, you have some real security in your job. Stick with us. You can also see some before and after. On the left, you see the rivets that are popped out. They look pretty bad. On the right, you see a completely addressed and repainted section. Up here on the forward side, the left picture is the starboard, which has already been addressed. We want to go back and do some other remedial work, but it looks really good. And the port side looks very, very ugly. It's not as bad as we might think, but I'll show you a little bit of detail here in a moment. So the specific work that we do is we take all the coatings down to base metal and we create that tooth for paint. We take care of rivet repair. We do clad welding or replacement. We'll show you a little bit of that. We do salt treatment. That sounds fun. Come on, ultrasonic testing the base metal. We have the capability for doing that. We feather new paint into old as needed. And we do a complete recoating using a 5-layer process of marine paints. And we have the capability for thickness gauging as well for the new coatings. And we have a cool vacuum system that Mary's really good at using, I think Paco as well. Come on, next one. Yeah, so it sucks everything off as you're taking it away so you can dispose of it correctly. So a really good system. In fact, the folks who saw this presentation last year at the Historic Naval Ships Conference, I had multiple people come up to us and say, hey, where'd you get that? We want to get it too. So good stuff on our part to find that. Of course, safety, I had to find the most smarmy looking safety guy I could. But we have PPE requirements, safety cables for the Cofferdam, which we've already had to use once before already. And we have to have an attendant up top, so if there's a problem down inside the Cofferdam, we're keeping an eye on things. So rivet exposure. Directly above the waterline, they're expanding and eroding, and there's some surface pitting in that area, but it's relatively minor. And so everything below the waterline looks good. You can see rivet head loss, where some of the rivets are literally disappearing. All right? They're just kind of eroding away. And understand these are a tapered head rivet with a flush fitting on the outside, so once they're hot set, they were ground off. So you wouldn't normally see them too much, just like an airplane in some ways. But they're literally disappearing in certain locations, and only in certain locations. It probably reflects the material or the local conditions of paint. Initial cleaning, this has been needle gunned and kind of cleaned up. And this one's in good shape. But still, we go ahead and clean it up a little bit more with a die grinder, and we get inside and we actually weld it. So I learned this from Dick Landgraf. This is what Long Beach Naval Shipyard did. In fact, they would have done it many tens of thousands of times on the rivets on the USS Missouri and the USS New Jersey back in the 80s, because those are the two vessels that Long Beach took care of. They didn't do that, I think, recently in their dry docking back east. But we grind it out, and then we weld it with 7018. So these are all being prepped. Paco and Mary down there taking a lot of care to make sure it gets done correctly. And then we weld them up, just seal weld them, and then we grind them down. Make them kind of rough, make sure we still have some tooth for paint. And so this is why it takes a good 10 to 14 days to rotate a cofferdam. There's a full, even a 5-day painting process. New twist for us is a seam between, it's actually a butt seam from two riveted plates. That's that horizontal line, and you can see that there's some welding as well. And that heat displaced the two plates enough that there was a little bit of residual oil. We don't have any oil in the vessel. I want to be very clear on that. But there was some oil behind the plate, and it seeped out. This is a caulked seam, but not the kind of caulking that people think about. This is not your DAP material you buy at Home Depot. This is an older technique that's still being used on some vessels and some other materials, where you take an air chisel and you actually jam the pieces, you hit it really hard. You do this on steam locomotive boilers, you do it on plates on hulls. It's not the caulking you think. There's no addition of material. They're actually forcing the two materials together under tremendous pressure and force. But we took care of this. I think it took Chief a couple of weeks to resolve all of that. We also can do testing. I think this left image is kind of funny. It looks like you're giving an injection to the ship, Dave. This is literally just I think it's a deionized water. We drop it in there, and then we can measure the salt content. Once we take it out, we have a little device. We can thickness gauge. Salt is an actual big problem. We have to do salt treatment. I have the funny salt treatment video here, image here. We're not doing that. We actually have something called chlorid, which deals with the salt inside the pores of the metal. So that needs to be addressed. And then coatings, we have a full system, full range of PPG. There are supporters, are great. Epoxy base coats, ABC is the antifoulant. We take care of all of that. We have thickness gauging and holiday testing capability. We're basically matching the existing work that we've already got. Of course, more cofferdams are better, at least to a point. This is the second one we built, $7,000. Steve is a great friend of ours over at Marine Sheet Metal over here on the island. And now we're going to move up forward again. This is that pitting corrosion, that section that we first exposed in 2017. This is a very specific type of corrosion. And again, this is in mild steel. So this is the cheaper steel that you would buy at Home Depot. And what it is, it's a localized problem. And it's usually due to one of these three factors. It's either coatings, the damage to them, or poor coatings, or there's some kind of non-uniformity or some kind of chemical problem inside the material. I'm kind of leaning towards the latter only because the metallurgy of the day wasn't as good and consistent as it might be today. So you can basically have just some weird chemistry in that little area, and the next thing you know, you've got this big divot. So notice the left, that bright image is actually a straight edge. You can see how rough, how many pits there are inside the hull. That's on the starboard side up here. And then I think that's Ken Labruzzi with a little screwdriver actually sticking his screwdriver into that divot. That means that the material in the back of that divot is probably only a 1/16 of an inch. Really interesting stuff. But the rest of the plate is okay. This is measurements from inside. I think Nate Jones and I did this back in 2012 for the insurance for our tow. The original plate thickness up forward is very thin. It's 7/16 of the material. It's not really thin comparatively speaking. Understand that the Fletcher class destroyer on the stern counter had 5/16 of material, or 312 thousandths of material on it. So it's really thin to begin with. 7/16 isn't bad. So the original thickness is that 0.4375. And you can see these are ultrasonic measurements from inside in roughly the same location as that last image. And you're running only 7 or 8% of reduction over 80 years. That's pretty doggone good. So you haven't lost that much material, but you've got these big divots in there. So we're going to have to address that and go back and deal with it. At the time, we just coated it. So working with our friends at Lit Niggles Shipyard down in Pascagoula, the chief engineer down there, Brian, gave us a spec that they use. I don't need to use a Navy spec, but we like some Navy specs. This is a flux core specification, and we can basically build up plate if we have to, or we can do something else. We can crop it out. The image to your left is from the North Carolina where they cropped out huge sections of the hull. They had so much damage from so many years of this at the wind and water line, reinforcing that problem, that they actually replaced, I think, 60 or 70 feet in that first year of cofferdam use. They had to because they literally had holes and water running in. They had pieces of wood. I think, John, you might have seen some of this, pieces of wood stuck in the holes to keep the water out. Yeah, it was pretty bad. Or you can use a little insert area too. The image on the right is not a bad image for that as well. So what if we wanted to go deeper? Thinking about dry docking. We're not going to dry dock. We're just not. Unless there's a miracle of money and or time, it's not going to happen. So if we have a problem down deeper in the ship, what do? Well, in the industry out there, there's a lot of options. Here we have a naval vessel having hull plate replacement down at 12 feet below the waterline. So we know we can go down 12 or 15 feet. I bet you on this vessel in most areas I can go down 25. So we have plenty of options with these cofferdams. You can kind of see the cofferdam shape here. I'll get up and just point it out real briefly. This is the ingress point. You'll see it in a moment. And this is the shape of the hull with a neoprene gasket. And there you can see on the left what it looks like just standing by itself. And on the right is actually inside that cofferdam, and that plate on the right has been cut out, completely exposing the inside of the vessel. And now it's been completely welded up. So this vessel did not need to go into dry dock to remove a whole section of plate on the side of it. So there's plenty of options out there. There may be some limitations in certain areas, but there's a lot you can do. Also pointing out, this is from a company called EM&I. They do diverless shell plating repair. They basically put on a plate on the outside, they seal it up, and then you come inside and you cut out that piece of plate and you replace it. And you do all the welding with full penetration. So there's a ton of things you can do. And another thing I was going to show you is something called a mob dock. This is from Hydrex. You can see this kind of funky tube-shaped thing over here on the left. That's actually the interface. The propeller's to your left, and this is part of their strut with the propeller shaft coming out. And you can see that guy over there inside that tube, and he's replacing a stern steel underwater. When you take a 100,000-ton vessel and try to go into dry dock, it's a lot more than $30 million. So commercial entities have created a lot of different techniques that you can work on these vessels in the water. In fact, even some of the classification agencies have come up with a term called UWILD, underwater work or inspection in lieu of dry docking. So there's actual work being done out there in the field, in the world. So this is our funny image here. We could be dry docking at 20-year intervals, high cost of 20 million or more, plus you have high risk for us potentially for a tow. That's one version, or we like the next version. We're a hull maintenance organization. So Iowa Permanente. So with this is Jonathan too, the classic marketing from Jonathan. So for $150,000 to $300,000 per year, inspections, Cofferdam work, cathodic protection, this is a pretty good investment overall. So we're doing a pretty good job. Long term, giving you a couple of ideas. I don't know if it would work here, but just giving you an idea in the industry. Most vessels don't have this capability or this opportunity, but to the left is BB-60, that's the Alabama. They've been completely ensconced within this cofferdam. They can drain. What they found over time is the same problems we've had. Wind and waterline. Down beneath, underneath, it's in great shape. Sitting in the mud, it's in great shape. The same thing is true over here on the right with BB-55, that's USS North Carolina in Wilmington, North Carolina. They had some different problems there. They were actually rising up and down the tide. The stern was actually slamming. They had to do a finite element analysis on that system just to make sure it wasn't damaging the ship from the rising and falling and bouncing in the mud, essentially. There are some other vessels that have had some damage from that. They were okay. They tried this big cofferdam option. They did a good job with it. But finally they said, to heck with that. We're just going to do the same thing the Alabama did and put ourselves inside of a huge cofferdam. It's all just a bunch of sheet pile, they call it, and they have to drain it. They're working in the mud, so there's some downside to it. But overall, it's a great kind of your own mini dry dock. You can never address the things on the bottom of the vessel because it's in the mud, but you can address everything else. So those are great options. I want to say the North Carolina was 15 or 16 million overall. John, if you've been paying attention, you go out there. You're from North Carolina, but that's about what it costs for them to do that. But here, I don't think it's an option.
Yeah, I don't remember what the cost was.
Yeah. So a couple of areas of concern for us long term. We still have to be concerned about this trimetallic hull, so we're going to keep our ICCP systems up and running very strong. We have continued degradation of rivets right there at the wind and waterline. Caulking needs, again, not your DAP caulking, not your material you squeeze out of a tube, but the other type. You have the skeg and hull penetration, cofferdam flooding. There's some challenges down there. I'm concerned about the skegs. I don't have any specifics right now, but just it's a remote area that's very difficult to work on. And you never know if you could have collision damage. You could have a vessel coming up the channel and bounce into us, and then what do? And maybe that's when the miracle of a $30 million dry docking comes along. Who knows? But we'll find out. And then you could have electrical hotspots. George knows about that, where if you have introducing electrical current into the hull in some specific location, you can start burning through pretty quickly. In fact, that's the reason we don't have the original ICCP system up and running, because it'll burn a hole through it. Right now it's grounded. And AC interference can cause problems too. That's a specific ICCP problem. So that's that. I think I triggered some people for some questions, but I think I remember them. So go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, well, the vessels and museum ships that have not been in dry dock, they have plans.
So Tom asked about vessels in the museum ship world that have not been dry docked. Do they have plans? And right now the answer is no for a handful that I can share with you. Two of them I've just shown you. North Carolina and Alabama are fully ensconced in their little world and they have no plans for that. I can also share that the USS Midway in San Diego they cannot dry dock either. Probably the only dry dock that can handle them is going to be either the Pearl Harbor or Bremerton docks because of their size, their sponsons. Plus, they're not really, I don't know if they're in towable condition, they might be. They were not mothballed well. So Len and also before him Charles, they did some great work down there. They do underwater coatings, they do a ton of underwater work, they've sealed up some of their penetrations. They've learned to live with the fact that they are not going to dry dock. There's at least one carrier that's been buried in the silt, Lexington down in Corpus Christi. They have no plans that I'm aware of. There's several other vessels that I know cannot. Some of this is driven by proximity. I can mention that the USS Massachusetts and Fall River, with a little bit of work, can be towed up to Boston. You know, there's a proximity discussion here for a local dry dock. Some of these vessels have no proximity or they have limited availability, much like us. So there's kind of a mixture out there. I think the smaller vessels, the destroyer escorts, the destroyers, and a few others have done really well with some major capital campaigns and have done some great dry docking availabilities. But I can think of only a handful. You know, it's really tough to do.
Of the 3 steels used to build Iowa, do we know what percentage STS is?
So the question is, what is the percentage of STS? I'd have to do a square foot analysis or a weight analysis. Again, it's the decapping plate. It's on the side. It's 8-foot slabs, 1.5 thick. The design was driven, as I understand it, from multiple authors to decap a torpedo or even a projectile. What some people may not know is that back in the 20s, the Japanese did some TOSA experiments firing projectiles and found that some projectiles could travel underwater and actually dive into the side of a vessel and cause just as much damage as a torpedo. So some of those ideas and those concepts and tests back in the 20s and 30s from other navies, other nations, kind of made their way into some of our philosophy. So I just want to either do it by weight or by square footage, and I could probably do that for you, but it would take me some time.
Okay. And aren't the mounts made of STS also, the 5-inch mounts?
So yes, the 5-inch mounts are in fact armored with STS plate. Yeah, STS plate could be rolled up to 4 inches thick according to our sources, and but that's about as far as it could go. If it was anything thicker, it would have been forged, according to our best source. So there were a couple of other questions, I think. You want to do it, John, or go ahead? Actually, Cliff.
What is different about the New Jersey that they're in dry dock now?
So the question is, what is different about New Jersey that they're in dry dock? I don't know. They're only 6 miles from a dry dock. They decided to do that. They have a different opinion. They're also in different shape. They've been in the Delaware River, which is at worst brackish occasionally, but probably more freshwater than not. You know, different institutions make different choices. Certainly a proximity of a dry dock to them would be a helpful one. They planned it, as they said, over 20 years. You know, some of the images we saw showed that, you know, a lot of the hull is in pretty decent shape. But they're in the Delaware River. It's a much different animal. Rick?
When I was doing fire watch for Paco this morning, I noticed on the second level, below the wind and water line, there's an enormous amount of sea growth. I mean, it's really thick, almost like carpet.
Yeah.
Will that degrade the hull in any way, or would we have to take the ship out 12 to 15 miles out to sea and have the hull scrubbed?
So this is a great question, and I love it. It's one of the ones I was trying to get someone to ask too. The question is, what do we do about this growth? Is it harming the ship in any way, and why don't we take it off? So there's one easy answer to the latter, and that is it's illegal to clean your hull in the harbor, the LA harbor, period, and a discussion. And I've got a fairly long document about all of that. It's legally, it's against the law. And so the reason would be because you don't want to scrape off some of the underlying coatings. All right. We are of the opinion, and there are differing opinions out there, but we believe that leaving the growth in place is the best avenue. If you start to scrape that off, you're actually going to start to ablate these coatings. You're going to start damaging the coatings underneath. So we don't want to do that. There are some discussions about, you know, what happens with some of these barnacles that kind of claw their way into paint. But our opinion still is, with a combination of ICCP and the fact that we have really good coatings and we're not disturbing it, we're just going to leave it alone. And we don't have any indication now during all of our dives that we have any problems with that strategy. Some of these museum ships are scrubbing them every year. We think that's a bad plan unless you're going to go into dry dock on a regular basis. And in fact, before we lost Dick Landgraf, again, one of the structural leads at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard, he shared with us that the New Jersey was among the 4 in the worst shape from a corrosion point of view, because one of the captains that they had back then had insisted on scrubbing the hull so much that they had lost coatings. She is the only one of the 4 sisters that lost her bow pad-eye for mine laying, or mine sweeping. So she had a lot of corrosion issues because of those coating issues. We don't want to deal with that. We want to leave it the way it is. There was one other question. Go ahead.
What does the Navy say about whether or not we have to dry dock?
So I love that. What does the Navy say about whether or not we have to? They don't say much at all. And there's even some different opinions out there, but I can be very clear with the contract and the language that we have. The contract that we have with the Navy says we own the vessel, it's our problem, and it is at no cost to the Navy that we must take care of it. End of discussion. It's very, very clear on that. It's much more vague, or really just awkwardly unclear about how to take care of it. They just want you to not embarrass the Navy. The language, I believe, says that you need to take care of it in a manner that keeps it running in perpetuity, meets the needs or the requirements or the desires of the Secretary of the Navy, and they're not going to come out and tell us how to do that at all. And it also has to be towable for dry docking, but it does not say that we have to dry dock the ship. Not at all. It's towable. It's towable right now. If Dave and I want to get this thing on our way, we'll do it. But I know, get me all excited. There's also some what I consider to be bad information out there. Some of these institutions have used a Navy document about inactive ships. Now understand, this ship is no longer on the Navy rolls. It is not owned by the Navy. They say that we own it. It clearly states that in the contract, even as it also says, but if we want it back, we'll take it back. But still, they don't want it. They're done with it. It is off the Navy rolls. It has no other influence from the Navy. But if you're an inactive ship still in mothballs and still on the rolls or on the list, they want to actually take care of their vessels in a different way. And so there's a document that's floating around that says that you should try to dry dock every 20 years. But the language is also softer. It says that if there's a financial problem or it's in good shape, you can delay. So some of these institutions are using that to their advantage, and it is what it is. So, but there's no requirement at all. Zero requirement. I want to be very clear from the Navy that we dry dock it. You might find people from the Navy saying, hey, it's a good plan, it's a good idea. Don't disagree. And again, all of us would love to see her out of the water. But as you can tell, there are some huge challenges to do that. Any other questions?
What's going on with the sea chest? Are they filling up with like life, or are they all closed off?
So Tyler's asking about the sea chest down below. So when this ship was mothballed, what they did in 1990-91 was they actually put cofferdams over every single sea chest on the vessel. And it's I want to say, Dave, what is there, 130 or 40 penetrations in the hull? Something like that? Yeah, and some of them are as large as 36 inches with a big grating on it. So the cofferdams are probably 8 foot long. Yeah, so they're pretty big. And they actually protrude from the bottom. In fact, there's an image. It doesn't look too dissimilar from... Give me a second. From that yellow thing, they look kind of like that. The ones on the New Jersey have been seen on Facebook. So there's a little bit of softening of the edges, but they're welded to the hull. And then all of these sea chest valves are in fact shut and chained and locked. I think there's even a lockout tag out for each one of those valves. So we're not going to see any leakage from them anytime soon. They're sealed off. There's at least 1 or 2 incidents I've heard of damage on these things. One other vessel of identical size and shape, what does that tell you, has bounced on the ground and damaged a sea chest and had some water come in. We're really good here. We're still good as far as being clear of the mud. So we're not going to bounce on anything soon. And that's a good question.
So, what's Midway going to do long term? They're never going to dry dock.
So the question is, what is Midway going to do long term if they're never going to dry dock? They're going to continue to take care of it in the water. You know, underwater coatings are amazing. I actually have a presentation on that as well. There's a lot of things you can do underwater. You can weld underwater. You can add plate underwater. I don't know if most people knew, but they were bouncing on the mud or the silt underneath on the stern. And just last year, 2 years ago, they cut the bottom of the rudders out and also the bottom blades of the propellers so they weren't bouncing anymore. think it was a $3 million project. Len presented on that last year. Underwater work in lieu of dry docking is something that's very viable, and we have to consider it. As you can see today, the options for dry docking are limited with some risk and a lot of money. So that's a good question. Dave?
Yeah, the other maritime museums around the world, what percent do we know? Are they running like fossil fuels or some? Or, yeah,
You mean if they're running ICCP?
yes.
So the question is, what percentage of the other vessels are running cathodic protection?
Right.
I would say that most of them are now. I don't have an exact number. I can comment on this, and my good friend Travis at the USS Texas, his organization has saved the Texas at this point, but they suffered from years of lack of that. Their vessel was donated in 1948, and they didn't receive their first active or impressed current cathodic system until 1984. So that's a lot of years of sitting in brackish and saltish water, and they really suffered from that. And there's some other techniques that were used back then that are known to be less desirable at this point. But most of them have them. Our good friend Lance from Anode Systems, Anode Solutions, does a great job. He's probably got at least 20 vessels that I know of. All the major ones have it. There's different techniques. There's sleds under the water. There's hanging anodes like we have. So that technology has been around for more than 100 years. Thomas Edison actually experimented with it before the turn of the last century. At least from the 20s, it's been used. It's used on this bridge, I guarantee it. The foundations have it. All the underwater pipelines out here, they all have cathodic protection in some form. So very, very common technology. Anything else? I'm here for autographs, hugs. No beers tonight. But yeah, happy to chat. If you guys have any questions you want to take offline, I'm happy to share what we know. It's been an interesting question. Everybody wants to know, why aren't we dry docking? And I get it. But there really are some reasons behind this. And it's easy to say on social media or anywhere else, oh, it's easy. Just go down to San Diego. Nobody's done the detail. Nobody's asked the questions. And that's who we are. We're about that actual fact-based decision-making process rather than just shooting from the hip on social media. So, Liberty Call, 5 o'clock.
5 o'clock.
All right. Anyways, I'm here. If you have any questions, please feel free. Come on up and I'll chat. And thank you for coming. Appreciate it.